with Leaside as well. I'm Judith Garfield from Eastside Community Heritage, and we've been working on this project for about the past 6 to 8 months, doing oral histories from voters, which are quite remarkable and quite wonderful. Luke Labs have been doing some fantastic workshops, about starting schools as far as environmental science, and I'll let Leaside and Luke Labs say all about the workshops maybe at the end of this. So good afternoon again. I want to start with a question. If I asked you the name of the great rivers of London, you'd probably say the Thames. Maybe the Wandle, if you know South London. But there's a river that's shaped the east of the city for thousands of years, that powered its mills, flooded its marshes, carried its goods to markets, nourished its eels, and today, right now, is home to a remarkable floating community, unlike anything else in London. That river is the Lea. Or the Lea, the Lea. Depending on who you ask. The spelling shifts depending on whether you're talking about the natural river or the navigation channels cut alongside it in the 18th century. Voters tend to call it by the Lea, L-E. Historians tend to call it by the Lea, L-E-A. Either way, it's been part of London's landscape for a very long time. This talk is about that river, its deep history, the communities it has sustained and sometimes displaced, the industries it powered, the politics it has provoked, and it draws on something quite special, the voices of the people who live on it today. Narrowboat dwellers who have shared their stories as part of the oral history project I just spoke about called Life on the Lea. Can we have the next slide? Right, the ancient river. And this is really before London in itself, came into being. The Lea rises in the Chiltern Hills in Bedfordshire, near Luton, fed by springs in the chalk. It flows roughly 46 miles southeast through Herefordshire, entering the flat plain, river plain of Essex and Middlesex, before joining the Thames at Bow Creek, just east of the old docks. For most of its length, it has formed a natural boundary between tribes, then kingdoms, then counties. For over 1,000 years, it divided Middlesex from Essex, and that boundary shaped everything: land ownership, parish systems, political allegiance, the very feel of the communities on either bank. Human settlement along the Lea Valley goes back to the Metholithic period, at least 10,000 years. The broad marshy valley floor was rich in fish, waterfowl and riverbeds. Bronze Age and Iron Age communities left traces throughout the valley. The Romans built Ermine Street along the western edge of the valley, and there is evidence of Roman settlements at several points along the river. The first historical drama on the Lea comes in 895 AD. The Viking great armies sailed their long ships up the Lea and established a fortified camp near Hereford. King Alfred of Wessex had his forces dig channels to divert the river, lowering the levels enough that Viking ships were stranded. The Danes had to abandon their boats and marsh overland. It's one of the earliest recorded examples of water engineering in English history. The marshes themselves, Hackney marshes, Walthamstow marshes, Leighton flats, Tottenham marshes, were common land in a specific legal sense, land over which local communities held ancient rights of grazing, fishing, reed cutting and peat digging. These were not wastelands. They were working shared landscapes regulated by long established customs rather than private ownerships. That idea of the river corridor as common space, belonging to everyone and to no one, is one that runs all the way through to the river today. Okay, next slide. The industrial river. To understand the Lea River today, you have to understand what it was for 500 years, one of the most intensive industrial river corridors in England. The industries that line these banks were not pretty. They were loud, dangerous, polluting, and utterly central to the economy of London, and at times to the survival of the British state. Starting with the mills, the Lea's gradient is gentle. It falls very gradually from the Chiltern source to the Thames, but not that gentle. Reliable flow make it ideal for milling. By the time of Doomsday in 1086, there were already numerous mills recorded along the river. Through the medieval period, these multiplied dramatically. Grain mills to grind wheat and barley at Herefordshire and Essex fueling mills to process the wool cloth that was one of England's greatest exports, paper mills producing the paper on which the growing literate society of the 16th and 17th centuries depended. At its height, the Lea had more working mills per mile than most any comparable river in England. Then there was gunpowder. From the late 16th century, the making of gunpowder became established in the Lea Valley, particularly around Waltham Abbey. The reasons were practical. The river provided water for grinding mills, the location was close enough to London to be convenient, but far enough away that a catastrophic explosion, and there were many, would not destroy the city. The Royal Gunpowder Mill at Waltham Abbey became one. Over 3 centuries, one of the most strategically important industrial sites in Britain. The gunpowder made at Waltham supplied the English fleet against the Spanish Armada in 1588. It surprised Marlborough campaign in the early 18th century and Wellington's armies in the Napoleon. Thank you. Some help is always The mills expanded again in the First World War. Then the demand for explosives was almost impossible to satisfy at the height of the First World War. They were producing hundreds of tons of propellant every week. By the Second World War, the technology had moved on to more sophisticated explosives. But the Waltham Abbey site remained central to the war effort until the mills finally closed in 1945. For over 350 years, the Lea Valley was quite literally the arsenal of the British state. The gunpowder industry was extraordinarily dangerous. Explosions were not uncommon. Workers were killed, buildings were repeatedly destroyed and rebuilt. The mills had a characteristic architecture designed to minimise the blast radius of an explosion. Low urban mounds called traverses separated the buildings so that if one went up, the others might survive. You can still see those at Waltham Abbey Royal Gunpowder Mill site today, and it's now open to the public as a museum. Alongside gunpowder, the valley developed a remarkable diversity of other industries: leather tanning, a filthy, smelly process requiring large quantities of water and producing noxious gases, concentrated along the lower River Lea and its tributaries. There were chemical works, paint manufacturing, rubber factories, distilleries, and from the 19th century, a growing cluster of engineering and metalwork firms. Hackney, Wick and Stratford at the southern end of the valley became a dense industrial zone whose products ranged from Clarnico sweets and priceless candles to the chemicals that supplied the Victorian building boom. Running through all this industry was navigation. The River Lea Navigation Act of 1739 created a body of trustees charged with improving the river for commercial traffic, dredging channels, building towpaths, constructing locks. Over the following decades, a series of cuts were dug alongside the natural river. By the late 18th century, the navigation was among the busiest inland waterways in the country. What moved on, it tells you a great deal about the economy of the time. Northwards from London, coal brought by sea to the Thames wharves at Limehouse and transshipped into barges for the journey up the Lea to the mills and factory houses of Herefordshire, southwards to London, grain and malt from Herefordshire farms, timber, chalk and lime for buildings, finished goods from the factories. The Lea was the artery connecting the agricultural hinterland of eastern England to the greatest city in the world. Sorry if anyone is outside of London. I'm a London nationalist, what can I say? And the industrial output of the valley to all its markets. The people who worked the barges lived on them. This was not romanticism, it was economic necessity. A boat family that paid rent for a house ashore was a boat family that couldn't survive on the margins of the trade. So they lived aboard generation after generation. Children were born on the water, growing up on the water, learning to handle ropes and locks and horses before they could read. Often never learning to read at all because the constant movement made schooling impossible, but by goodness they learned the trade. These were tight, self-contained communities with their own customs, their own dialect, words, their own ways of doing things. The boats were decorated with distinctive roses and castle paintwork, that became the signature of canal culture. Bright, intricate patterns on every available surface. A kind of folk art that expressed pride and identity in cramped conditions. The women were skilled navigators and boat handlers, as well as homemakers. The children were put to work early, leading the horse down the towpath, working the lock paddles, helping to load and unload at the wharves. These were also the people that George Smith of Colville, a former nonconformist and a man of considerable self-righteousness, decided to save in the 1870s. His campaign, which led to the Canal Boats Act of 1877 and 1884, required canal boats used as dwellings to be registered and inspected. In practice, a profound suspicion of people who lived outside the fixed, registered, taxable structures of society. People who had no fixed addresses, who paid no tax, who paid no rates, who slipped through the mesh of the administrative state. One of those people I spoke to for this project, Molly, who lives on a narrowboat on the Lea today, had come across this history through her university studies. I think we've got Molly's interview. I think it might be the first one, Bill.
So people don't own companies.
No, it's the next one.
I think what's beautiful about this river is it's all the way up.
No, I'll read it, it's fine.
There.
Badly put into a PowerPoint. I apologise for that, Molly. You're sitting there. I'm going to read your wonderful interview, all right? I know a bit about the history of London canals in terms of how they were used from the start of the Industrial Revolution, where they were used with horses to cart products and what have you, to the markets and stuff. And then there were trains were introduced. They were kind of used as regressive. They were a symbol of olden times, so that kind of symbolism was also passed on to the people who were living there, which tended to be poor families, families where the children didn't go to school. There was some guy who was trying to ban people from living on canal boats and did it in terms of it was for the defence of the children and the women, but these people would otherwise be homeless. The way that he projected a message was just very degrading. Thank you, Molly, for your interview. The trains did come. The Eastern Counties Railway, later the Great Eastern, drove its line through the Lea Valley in the 1840s, running almost parallel to the navigation for such of its length. For the first time, goods could move faster by rail than by water. The commercial canal trade contracted slowly. It did not die all at once, but the direction of travel was clear. By the early 20th century, the working boat families were a diminishing community. The last regular commercial carrying on the Upper Lea effectively ended in 1970, when the delivery of malt to the brewery at Ware ceased. The era of the working boat was over. What remained was the infrastructure, the locks, the towpaths, the wharves, the lockkeepers' cottages, and the waterway itself, clean and quiet for the first time in centuries, waiting for new uses and new communities to find it. The boating community that lives on the Lea today is not descended from those Victorian working families. It's something newer, and in many ways something older. A community that grew substantially from the 1980s and 1990s onwards, driven partly by rising housing costs and partly by a set of values and politics that would have been recognisable in some form to the common rights holders who grazed their cattle on the Lea marshes centuries ago. Bethany, another one of our interviewers, has been on the water for 13 years. She came to it via squatting, occupying empty buildings in the 2000s with a group of friends and political comrades, running free schools and social centres, looking for ways to live outside the logic of the private property market. She draws a direct line from that experience to life on the water. Will you play the top one?
This is your bit.
Don't mind, I'll read it, okay? My politics around moving on to, this is your bit, Bethany.
Oh, crikey.
Okay?
No pressure.
I know.
My politics around moving onto a boat are sort of continuation of what was going on with squatting. It was, freedom to have a sort of sense of autonomy, just freedom generally, and not wanting to have my whole existence be paying somebody else who has the capital to buy a property which I didn't have. It just seemed mad to me that if you start with something, you get more, and if you don't start with something, you're just paying the richer people. The squatting movement she was part of was a remarkable thing. In the late 2000s, a network of activists occupied empty and derelict buildings across East London, setting up community centres for universities, space for organising. Bowl Court near Liverpool Street, Rampart in Whitechapel, a social centre that ran for 15 years and became a hub for anarchist and radical politics. They were not simply places to live cheaply, they were experiments in how communities could organise themselves without landlords, without hierarchies, without the normal structures of capitalist societies. There's another one from Bethany, but you want to move on to the next slide anyway. We were looking for kind of like an alternative way of living and organising and being in a community. We were basically broke into buildings and opened up like community social centres. We would get university professors, we would get different community groups or history groups, and they would be running workshops and skill shares. We called it the free school. So we set up these weekends where everybody would come and do workshops and share and skill shares and share different expertise and kind of like challenging the whole idea of basically university and challenging the hierarchy of knowledge. Then the law changed. In 2012, squatting in residential buildings was criminalised by the Legal Aid Sentencing and Punishment Offenders Act. Bethany watched the familiar pattern unfold, a media campaign, a moral panic, a legislative response that arrived ready-made. An influx of activists and community organisers moved on to votes around 2012. Bethany was among them, and she brought her politics with her. Molly arrived at the water differently. She grew up in Plymouth, moved to London with a partner, and found herself working as a barista in South Hackney, right by the canal. The canal became her lunch break refuge. I was a barista, and it was right by the canal, and I'd go and sit on my lunch break, sit by the canal and just watch. This is Molly, by the way. And it was just, it definitely became like a pipe dream, something that I would fantasize about, but not necessarily. I didn't consider it to be something I could actually do. What the water offers is not simply cheaper housing. Both Bethany and Molly are emphatic about this. The trade-offs are real and significant. People don't only come here because it's cheap. It might be cheaper money-wise, but you know you've emptying your toilets, you're making fires. Sometimes I go to meetings during the day for work and I come back and I feel like I live like a Victorian. I'm carrying buckets of water. And this is Bethany speaking, by the way. And I'm like chopping wood. So it's trade-off. People come here often, I think deep down because they believe in sort of inherent nature of it. Being in common land, being in common spaces, being in nature. Yeah, being free, really. Molly describes her first winter. The fear of lighting a fire, a small wooden space surrounded by water, the hot water bottles, the gradual realisation that it was manageable, even pleasurable. This is Molly speaking, once you get into the groove of it, yeah, you're going to be cold when you wake up, probably unless you manage to keep your fire on overnight, which I haven't managed to do yet. So you're a bit cold in the morning, but that's fine. Make a coffee, chill out, and then when you come home, you just stick the fire on straight away. I think I'm fine with a bit of rain, a bit of wind, being like Plymouth and all. It's always raining, so maybe that's unknown and has trained me for boater life. Thank you, Molly. Sorry we're not playing the sound. We can try it again, but it's not that loud. But all the sound will be on our website, and upstairs there are sound clips as well. Molly also describes the canal freezing over in winter, waking to find a waterway locked solid, picking up a stick and poking at the ice, going nowhere. And then hearing the fuel boat with its distinctive, heavy, chugging engine breaking through the ice, the sound of cracking echoing down the silent canal at Enfield in the early morning. And there is community. Perhaps the most consistent and surprising theme in both interviews, boating has a culture of mutual aid born partly from necessity. Things go wrong on boats, engines fail, ropes break, propellers get fouled with plastic bags. You often need help and you learn to give it. Molly describes both karma. It's highly likely that something is going to go wrong at some point, and you will probably need someone else's help at some point. So you give the help when you can. It will come full circle. The community is strikingly diverse. Molly describes it. Many younger people, a notable proportion of women and non-binary people, a lot of creative people who have found that life on the water, by reducing the financial pressure of rent, gives them time to make art, music, write, organise. There are also people on the Lea living in very different circumstances. At the other end of the spectrum from Molly's carefully researched purchase and Bethany's political rooted choice, there are people moored in DIY boats at Tottenham who may otherwise be homeless, living in fiberglass hulls with wooden structures built on top. The people with wide beams, you know, they might have been saving up for a while, very nice boat, and then you have the other side, which is a lot of people, if you go to Tottenham, who I think might otherwise be homeless, kind of very DIY boats, kind of fiberglass ones, and they built like a wooden box around them. You know, they're like sunken boats on either side. These people, I think, are really interesting. Their reason for being a boater might be a lot different than mine or somebody else's. And it comes from Molly's interview. Can we move on? Oh, I'll leave that one. And actually, move on to the next one now. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. No event has shaped the Lower Lea Valley more dramatically in recent memory than the 2012 London Olympics. To understand what that transformation meant, what was gained and what was lost, you need to understand what the Lower Lea was before the diggers arrived. In the late 20th century, the area around Stratford, Hackney, Wick, Fish Island and the Lower Lea navigation was one of the most industrial, complex and ecologically peculiar places in London. It was not picturesque. It was a patchwork of chemical works, recycling yards, printing firms, artist studios, travellers' sites and small manufacturing businesses that had been pushed east and south by rising rents in the rest of the city. The land was contaminated. Decades of industrial use had left the soil laced with heavy metals, hydrocarbons, and other pollutants. The waterways were neglected. The Bowback River is a tangle of channels threading through the delta where the Lea meets the Thames, were in places virtually inaccessible. But it was also, paradoxically, a place of extraordinary vitality. The cheap rents had attracted artists, musicians and creative businesses in large numbers through the 1990s and 2000s. Hackney, Wick and Fish Island became one of the densest concentration of artist studios in Europe. And I know this personally because my sister had an artist studio there for many, many years. The community of people who lived and worked there alongside the existing working class communities of Stratford and Leighton had deep roots and strong attachments to the place. The Olympic bid, won in 2005, I'm sure we all remember that day, required the clearance of much of this area. Somewhere between 200 and 500 businesses were displaced, depending on how you count. Travellers' sites were cleared, studios were demolished, the communities that built themselves enlarged in the gaps of this industrial landscape were scattered across East London and beyond. The justification was regeneration, the creation of a world-class sporting venue that would leave a legacy of improved infrastructure, green space and economic development for some of the most deprived communities in England. Whether that promise has been kept is still being debated. The Olympic Park itself, now the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, is a remarkable piece of landscape architecture, threading new waterways, wetlands and apartments through what was contaminated industrial land. The velodrome and the aquatic centre are genuinely beautiful buildings. The Waterworks River, the City Mill River, the Chelsea River, all clean, landscaped and open to public access in ways they have never been before. But regeneration has its shadow side. The communities that were displaced did not always benefit from what replaced them. House prices and rents in Stratford, Hackney, Wick and the surrounding area rose sharply after 2012, making the area inaccessible to many of the people who had lived there before. The artist studios that survived the clearances found themselves priced out within a few years. The promised affordable housing in the Olympic Legacy Zone has been delivered only partially. that is still work to be done. The Lea navigation itself, the waterway that runs along the western edge of all this development, occupies an interesting position in relation to the Olympic transformation. On one hand, the investment in the valley's waterways improve the environment for boaters, cleaner water, better towpaths, new access points. On the other hand, the rising desirability of the area brought new pressure on the mooring spaces along the navigation and contributed to the broader process by which East London became more expensive and less accessible. Bethany, who's been living on the Lea since 2013, a year after the Games, watched the transformation of the area around Stratford with a mixture of appreciation and unease. The new parkland is generally beautiful, but she's aware that the narrative of regeneration often conceals a story of displacement. From Bethany's interview, this is something a little broken in society at the moment around access to a home, and there's very few ways to reject that. And I feel like by being a boater, we have sort of said, I don't really want to be part of that system. The rich people own the houses, own the land, and if you don't have enough wealth to get a little bit for yourself, then you're kind of, I won't say the word. And that's just not a good enough answer. The post-Olympic period has also transformed the ecology of River Lea in ways that are genuinely positive. The cleaning of the waterways, the creation of new wetland habitats, and the establishment of water-still wetlands open to the public in 2017, one of the largest urban wetland reserves in Europe, have brought wildlife back to parts of the valley where it has been absent for generations. Kingfishers, herons, egrets and otters now use a network of waterways that runs through what was a generation ago one of the most heavily industrialised landscapes in London. The Lea Valley Regional Park Authority, established in 1967 and covering 26 miles of the valley from Ware in Hertfordshire down to the Thames, played a crucial role in protecting and shaping this legacy. Established at a time when the valley was still heavily industrial and the idea of green space as a planning priority was far from mainstream. The Park Authority spent 5 decades acquiring land, improving access and managing the tension between recreation, nature conservation and the needs of the communities along the valley. Molly, navigating the waterways through all of this, noticed the traces of industrial heritage embedded in its landscape. You've got Tottenham and then you've got on one side a huge field and used to be an old water refinery or something. That's there and that's pretty cool. The look always made it feel very Victorian architecture, you know. Next you've got Tottenham and then you've got on one side a huge field. What the Olympics made visible and the years since have confirmed is that the Lea Valley is not simply a post-industrial space awaiting development, it's a living landscape with deep histories, contested commons and communities whose relationship to the water and land is older and more complex than the planning document acknowledges, or legislation acknowledges. Running through the history of Lea Valley like a thread that never quite breaks is the conflict over common land. The marshes and the river corridors were common land, and common land has always attracted those who would rather it were private. The great enclosure movement of the 18th and 19th centuries largely bypassed the Lea Valley marshes, partly because the land was too wet to be worth enclosing for agriculture, and partly because the commoners who held rights over it were numerous and not easily pushed aside. The Corporation of London fought legal battles in the 1860s and 1870s to protect what remained, and the Commons Act of 1876 gave significant protection to metropolitan commons. Walthamstow marshes were subject of a partially hard-fought battle in the 1980s, when proposals to develop part of the marshes for housing and industry were defeated by sustained public opposition. Their designation as a site of special scientific interest in 1983 provided legal protection that has held. But the conflict over common space has never ended. It has simply changed its form. Today it's the question of who has the right to be on the waterway and on what terms. Bethany frames the principle of boating community she helped organise. The only kind of ideology or principle that we could agree on really to fund the whole experience experience of boating was that we live in common land and we want to protect common land. I, as a boater, don't feel I have any more right to that tow path than the person who's been walking their dog there for 40 years, or the person who goes running there and needs that space every day for their mental health. This is shared, you know. She's also alert to the way nature is sometimes evoked to exclude people rather than to include them. Bethany's interview. It's funny when people think nature needs to be super pristine, because I'm like, do you know that the marshes like Leighton Marsh is basically rubble? Woods was planted as compensation for them building a road somewhere else. You know, it used to be a football pitch. It's like we've shaped this land, the canal, you know, it isn't even supposed to be here. The politics of the river. The Canal and Rivers Trust, which manages the waterway network, operates the licensing system under which continuous cruisers live. To hold a licence without a permanent mooring, as most boaters, as some boaters do, you must demonstrate bona fide navigation, moving regularly and not returning to the same stretch in a set period. The rules around accounts of sufficient movement have been tightening. The CRT, as they're known, have been lobbying Parliament for the new legislation that will give it greater powers to move on voters it considers a nuisance. Bethany, who helped found a new voters organisation, organised specifically to defend the community's interests, sees uncomfortable historical echoes. From Bethany's view, I feel right now, as a voter, with the way CRT are approaching the voting community, it feels like I'm almost about to see the end of another transient nomadic way of life. The media is turning on us, they're in Parliament saying that we're, you know, antisocial behaviour. It's like, oh my God, it's happening again. That this sort of little glimmer of autonomous way of living is about to be crushed. The language used to describe people who live outside conventional settled housing has remained remarkably consistent across centuries. In the 1870s, canal boat families were depicted as neglecting their children, evading education, living in squalor. Today, boaters are depicted as antisocial, evading council tax, clogging waterways. The detail changes the underlying anxiety about people who will not be fixed in place, who live in common space rather than private space, remains constant. Bethany is clear-eyed about the difficulty of defending the community. The boating community is nomadic, often digitally marginalised, and entirely without political representation. We're just a bit vulnerable. We've got the things that you might need to effectively self-organise. That's harder being transient and lacking electricity and internet signal, and people not being so digitally literate. We have no means of political representation, and we're very, very visible. Everything we do is visible. If I left my rubbish on the tow path today, I'd have 300 people passing it saying, God, those boaters leave their rubbish out. That's from Bethany's interview. I just want to finish off really talking about the ecology. Running through all these conversations of the river as a living thing, a river that people notice, know intimately and are worried about. The ecology of the Lea has changed dramatically over centuries. The great marshes that once extended across the valley floor have largely been drained or built over. The water quality of the Lea, which was once a major eel and salmon river, deteriorated severely through the 19th century as London industries grew and the river absorbed their waste. By the early 20th century, the Lower Lea was among the most polluted waterways in Britain, as I've said. Legislation from the 1950s onwards brought gradual improvement, and the Lea today supports kingfishers, otters, herons, and an impressive variety of fish. But the river is still under pressure. Molly describes oil spills that degrade her freshly painted hull and plastics that tangle in the propeller. You see the coots and the birds and the moorhens and everything in the canals, and you're just looking around, and I can literally see a rainbow of oil surrounding them. This is grim. Bethany, who grades water quality daily for her work at Leaside Trust, is clear about where the problem really lies. From Bethany's interview, all summer we didn't have a green day where there was no evidence of sewage. So that means we've just got a whole generation of young people who are basically being deprived of safe access to nature. The newspaper articles make out that we're all throwing our you-know-what in the river. And the irony is that someone is throwing you-know-what in the river, but it's not boaters. It's big private businesses who are making a lot of money from it. The boaters know this river is ways that passes by. The boaters know that the river in ways that passes by do not. They know its moods across seasons. They know where the oil comes from after the rain. They know where the plastic bags accumulate. Molly describes the wildlife changing as you travel the length of the Lea. You've definitely got a lot of coots and moorhens, more in central London, I think, because they like the rubbish. Well, they're able to use the rubbish effectively. They build nests in the tyres that hang off your boat. And then as you go further out, you get waking up in Herefordshire, and you'll just see like flocks of geese or swans passing through all the time in the morning. The River Lea is not a grand river. It does not have the symbolic weight of the Thames. It has no Tower Bridge, no House of Parliament, no great sweep of embankment. What it has is something older and in some ways more interesting. A continuous human presence stretching back 10,000 years. A landscape shaped by flooding and drainage, by mills and locks and gunpowder, by common rights and enclosure, by working families and industrial capital, and now once again by people looking for a way to live in this city that is theirs and not theirs. Bethany named her son River Lea. He was born just over there, and he was born on the Lea, and his birth certificate records Dorney Fields as a place of birth. She works now at Leaside Trust, taking 1,000 children onto the water every year, connecting them to the landscape. I really love this river. I love this river. It's just so precious. I think that's the last step. Is there any comment on the slide? No, that's just the thank you. I really love this river. I really love this river. It's so precious, and that's from Bethany's interview. And this is really the little bit I'm going to finish on. That preciousness is not inevitable. The common land of the Lea Valley has been fought over for centuries. The right to be on this waterway, to move through it, to make a life on it, it is contested now as it always has been. The history of the river is the history of those contests and of the communities that, against the odds, have kept their connection to water alive. The people who live on it today carry that history, whether they know it or not. And if we want the Lea to remain what it's been for 10,000 years, a river that sustains communities, that provides common ground, that belongs to the people who live on it and by it, then the history is worth knowing. Thank you very, very much for listening.
Such a great talk. It was nice to see all of the Lea just sort of set out. Gosh, I had to keep dipping out in case people fell in the no, I'm joking. I didn't know I was going to feature so heavily, but yeah, it's nice. So yeah, having lived on the Lea and really just finding this river such a sort of precious resource for boaters, but also the wider community for sort of over decades really. I came here to Leaside 2 years ago, and I'd never set foot in the place, and it was always like this place on the corner, but I didn't really know what it did, and when I came in actually for an open day and realised they were looking for a manager, I thought, oh, my partner said, you could do that, and I thought, I don't know how to kayak, I still don't, by the way, but I just thought it's such an incredible place. And so, yeah, I've been here for 2 years, and I think one of the biggest things I've realised walking in the gates and really just trying to open the place up to the community as much as possible and make it a shared community asset, the biggest thing that I've realised is the weight of the history of this place. Since the 1960s, children, young people, at that time it was the Lea Integrated London Education Authority or something, which meant that every child across every school got free access to go on the water. So literally all the kids in East London would come down here, they'd go paddling, and from the 1960s, 70s, and that is such a sort of powerful thing. We even had a builder come do work, and he said, I was just coming here and it was like I was coming back to a dream from my childhood, because I used to come paddling here, and just so often I hear people who grew up in East London finding this place in amongst their sort of urban lives, and being here in the countryside, and what an incredible opportunity that it provided. So we've got this long history of doing youth work, schools work, and that's something that I really felt strongly needed to be protected for generations to come. So yeah, we've been doing a lot of work over the last 2 years, opening up to the community, like I say, expanding our youth work programme so that young people from all backgrounds in Hackney have got access to, you know, what's on offer here. Also connecting more with the boater community, which I wear that hat too. So we've got quite sort of deep relationships now and do things in collaboration. And it's really lovely to have this day with Loop Labs and this whole project really, to celebrate that history and legacy. And I think a big mantra that I have in my work is that, you know, I want this place to be here in 60 years' time, still supporting the young people of Hackney, Waltham Forest and Haringey, to have access to nature, because this is such a precious spot. You know, it's like the countryside in Zone 2. You don't, you know, and yeah, I'm waffling now. What else to say? Something that we have to do a lot of work on is actually about the river itself, the health of the river. Because obviously we're taking young people out onto the water, and we need to know that we're not putting them in harm's way. And, you know, since